as to be almost unrecognizable. If he didn't tell us that he was talking about Io, Medea, Helen, we wouldn't know it from the account that he gives you. And fascinatingly enough, and I'll discuss what this may mean in a few minutes, Herodotus attributes this logos to Persian logioi, or learned men. Right after his opening sentence, as soon as he's finished saying that he wants to examine why Greeks and Persians went to war with one another, then he says, the Persian learned men, the Persian logioi, tell the following stories, and he launches right into a rationalized version.
For Loco Friday, and I got a juice. My bad, y'all.
According to this rationalized version, the enmity between Europe and Asia began and was exacerbated by a series of kidnappings and counter-kidnappings. Herodotus says that the Persians say that the enmity began when Phoenician traders kidnapped Io from Argos. Now, in myth, Io was one of Zeus's lovers. The god Zeus had a great many affairs with mortal women. Io was one of them. And according to myth,
just one of them,
Zeus knew that Hera was about to become suspicious of Io. He turned Io into a cow to disguise from Hera the fact that she was his lover. Hera was not deceived. She sent a gadfly to torment Io in cow form, and the gadfly drove Io around all the known world, more or less. The poor girl, or heifer, wandered everywhere, eventually came to Egypt, where she was eventually restored to her human form and gave birth to a son named Epiphus, whom she supposedly conceived when Zeus laid his hand on her to turn her back from being a cow into being a human being. In her cow or partially cow form, Io was often associated in Greek thought with the Egyptian goddess Isis, who is shown in Egyptian art with cow horns. Now, Herodotus doesn't make this identification. In fact, he says in Book 2, in his description of Egypt, Herodotus says that Isis is represented as a woman with cow horns the same way the Greeks represent Io. So he doesn't assume that Isis and Io are the same entity. But the fact that some Greeks did assume that Isis and Io were the same entity is an indication of how seriously her story was taken by the Greeks. And yet Herodotus says that she was kidnapped from Argos by Phoenician traders, and that's about all he says about it. Or rather, he says that's what the Persians say about this story. Next, he says, the Persian logioi, the Persian learned men, continue. Some Greeks landed in Tyre and kidnapped the Tyrian princess Europa. Now, again, in standard Greek myth, Europa's lover was Zeus, disguised as a bull. He abducted the young girl Europa from Tyre, took her to Crete, where she became the mother of 3 sons, including the famous Cretan king Minos. Herodotus alludes to the Cretan connection when he says that the Greeks who kidnapped Europa were presumably Cretans. But he says nothing about Zeus, nothing about Minos, nothing about the standard mythological resonances of this story at all. The next episode in the rationalized account was also a Greek offense against the Asians. Herodotus says that Greeks sailed to Aea in Colchis on the Black Sea and took Medea. Now this refers, so much in passing that it's almost invisible, to the famous expedition of Jason and the Argonauts. The Greeks who sailed to Colchis and took the Colchian princess Medea were Jason and the Argonauts in the famous quest for the Golden Fleece. None of that appears in the version that Herodotus gives us here. He simply says that some Greeks sailed to Colchis and took the princess Medea, and that Medea's father, the king, sent to Greece to demand her return and ask for reparations, but that the Greeks justified their refusal to give her back or pay any reparations by saying that you, i.e. Asians in general, had never paid any compensation for Io. And then, Herodotus says, a generation later, Alexander, or Paris, heard about all this, decided he could get himself a Greek wife without any consequences, and took Helen. Now, clearly, this runs entirely counter to the mythic tradition. There's no judgment of Paris in this version, no beauty contest between 3 goddesses, no approval of Aphrodite for the abduction and or seduction of Helen. It's simply a matter of Paris thinking, well, if other people can kidnap wives from other countries, so can I. I'll go